Welcome back to the channel, guys. So I found this beautiful piece of olive wood and it has this really cool hole in the middle, and I thought I could make a pretty cool coffee table or side table out of it. So I started by removing all of that dead wood and all of the dirt from the middle because I'm going to fill that with some black epoxy. So I went over to my flattening jig, which I made in my previous video, and this is where I made my first mistake. I took a huge chunk of wood out of it, which was definitely not supposed to happen. So I came back the next day and I used some playing cards to make sure that it was actually flat. I used some double-sided tape to make sure that it wasn't going to move around as much, and I upgraded my router bit to a bigger piece. So I was actually able to fix the problem, but I did take quite a lot of size off of the piece. I went back and forth in my head whether I was going to take off the bark on the edges because I did think it looked pretty cool, but I felt that it would still look great without the bark there, and also this would probably save me a lot of issues later down the line. So once I had the piece all cleaned up, I decided to go with the method of using this heavy-duty waterproof tape to seal up the slab and prepare it for the epoxy. So after waiting for about a month, my epoxy finally arrived and it was time to mix it all together. So I decided to go with a jet black, so I put in the dye and mixed that all up, and it was finally time to pour the epoxy. So I decided to just fill it up halfway and then do the second half at a later stage, and then I used this syringe to fill in all of those little gaps and cracks along the edges. So actually this went pretty well. I was pretty happy and things were looking really good.
2 hours later.
So in typical beginner woodworker fashion, things did not go to plan and it spilled everywhere and made a massive mess. So I cleaned up my mess and I retaped up the bottom with this even thicker tape this time. I was able to save some of the epoxy, and over 24 hours it had cured into this thick tacky texture. So I used that to create a base layer at the bottom, and then I remixed some epoxy and went for my second pour, and I was feeling pretty confident this time. But this time somehow it went even worse and immediately started dripping out. So to prevent the epoxy from dripping out of the end, I used some caulk, which normally is used to seal windows with, and then whatever amount of epoxy that I was able to salvage, I left into that hole and left it over for another 24 hours to cure even further to create a strong base layer. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of bubbles in there, so I used my blowtorch to pop those, and that was pretty satisfying to watch. So now it was time for my third and final attempt, because this was the last of the epoxy that I had left over. So luckily this time it worked, and it was time to leave it for another 3 days to fully cure. So once I came back, it was completely stuck to my workbench, so I had to try and get that off. So once I removed it, it was time to get rid of all of that tape, which, as you can see, was pretty painstaking and really time consuming to take off. Once I'd gotten off as much as I could, it was time to go back to the flattening jig, and I used these blocks this time to prevent the piece from moving around too much. This was really satisfying at this point because I could really start to see the epoxy take shape. Then I flipped it over and flattened the top side. So there was quite a lot of little imperfections left over from the flattening process, so I used some more epoxy to fill up all of those little gaps. And as you can see here, there was still quite a lot of little holes and chip out, so I actually used some super glue to fill in those holes, and then some activator spray, and that immediately cured, and then I started the sanding process. So that actually worked really well, and you can see all of those little holes are gone at this point. So I got this free bottle of Odie's oil because my epoxy arrived so late, and I decided to use that to finish off the slab. And it was pretty satisfying to really start to see that wood come to life. So the final step was to attach the legs, and we'd be finally done.